Hi, this is Mark Moneypenny. This is my EDL 851 case study. A good teacher turns bad. Stress at home causes problems at school. Problem identification and analysis in category one. What I know is Crestview Elementary. It's one of three elementary schools. It's a small school in a rural area. It's always had good attendance, above average test scores, and parents are happy with the school. It's a small school. It only has 18 classroom teachers, one librarian, one counselor, two special education teachers, and only three aides to go around to the whole school. Mrs. Jean Wilson, she attended 4 years of night school to get her teaching degree. She had a lot of classroom experience, I believe 13 years. In her first year, she was administrator. She did not want to cause any change. She always referred back to one of her professor's advice as not rocking the boat. Mrs. Horton, she's the first grade teacher, and she's a former teacher of the year for the school district, and she's a seasoned professional. The scenario is Mrs. Wilson is in her third year, soon after spring break. Mrs. Wilson noticed a change in Mrs. Horton with attitude, arguing with teachers, and just constant disagreement. Colleagues informed Mrs. Wilson that Mrs. Horton was having a rough time at home. Her husband had left, and she was raising her boys by herself. The year went on, finished with no incidents, and principal was just hoping that everything was just going to work itself out over the summer. The summer was uneventful. Mrs. Wilson was making preparations at the school. Mrs. Horton was always known for coming in over breaks and just being around the school, but it was noticed that she was absent over basically the whole entire summer. Mrs. Wilson assumed that the problems were still present. The school year started off without any problems. Crestview Elementary was chosen to pilot a new reading program. Mrs. Wilson and most of the faculty supported this change. Ms. Horton was adamantly against this program. Mrs. Wilson met with Mrs. Horton, and the opinion still did not change about it. This first 6 weeks of school, Mrs. Wilson was receiving phone calls about complaints about Mrs. Horton about being abusive to children, screaming at them, not being on time for work, refusing to conduct parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Wilson said she had visited the classroom. She didn't find any evidence. She was telling the parents, but the parents just were not satisfied with that answer. That did not reassure them whatsoever. The superintendent later called Mrs. Wilson. 4 parents had called the members of the Board of Education and complained about Mrs. Horton, demanding their children be removed of the class. Mr. Stafford, a parent, came to talk with Mrs. Wilson about their daughter Julie. He wants Julie moved to another class immediately. She's hysterical in the mornings, crying, having problems sleeping and eating. Just not good for her health. Mrs. Horton has not responded to his wife at all about any conferences. The wife has tried to contact her many times, and he refuses. He actually said it refuses for his daughter to have one more day of torture in the class, so it's obviously pretty bad. Mrs. Wilson would arrange a meeting for the 3 of them to meet, did not make any promises and make any changes till after the meeting. Mrs. Wilson spoke to Mrs. Horton about the situation, and she was very defensive, but agreed to meet. Mr. Stafford arrived early for the meeting. Mrs. Horton greeted the principal and Mr. Stafford at the door as they were escorted down. Mrs. Horton was not prepared for the meeting. Mr. Stafford became irritated when she was going back to her desk and trying to get papers. Mrs. Wilson started the meeting asking for the purpose. The purpose was he intended to have his daughter removed from the class and put into the other class. Mrs. Wilson asked for an explanation. Mr. Stafford claims that she upsets the children, screams at them all day, embarrasses them, and that's when Mrs. Horton just shouted out, "You're a liar. None of them are true." Her face is turning red. She was very confrontational. Mr. Stafford was shocked. I could just imagine just looking back on what do I do now. He asked Mrs. Wilson for help. Mrs. Wilson said we need to postpone the meeting. I informed Mr. Stafford that I would call him later, and she just needed to discuss the issue with the teacher in a more in depth to see what's going on, and she would be calling him to see what the result would be. Mrs. Wilson was actually just stunned. Mrs. Horton was still very angry and in a very defensive posture. What I need to know is, did Mrs. Wilson document any of the issues of the previous years or what was going on? Has Mrs. Horton told or asked Mrs. Wilson for help for problems in the past? Are there any previous issues with Mrs. Horton in the classroom? Did Mrs. Horton's colleagues report any of these issues to Mrs. Wilson? Because if they're not reporting anything, she's probably not going to know a whole lot's going on. What were the superintendent's thoughts on the matter? Did the school board make any suggestions of what they wanted to have done with Mrs. Horton or the students? How did Mrs. Wilson not know Mrs. Horton was arriving late to school? It's a relatively small school. I know the schools I've been at. If you're late, the principal knows. And was anyone watching Mrs. Horton's class when she wasn't there? Were the kids just by themselves? And if so, who was watching it, and why didn't they report it to the principal? And how many other students were feeling like Julie, not wanting to come to school? And what policies are in place for this type of behavior, reacting this way in a meeting and just being this way at school? And were there any meetings about the reading program, any professional developments? And did any teachers voice their opinions about the reading program besides Mrs. Horton being so adamant she didn't want to have it? Problem identification and analysis. Mrs. Wilson did not address the issue the first year over spring break. She just kind of let it go. She just didn't want to rock the boat. In the first 6 weeks of school, Mrs. Horton is unable to do her job effectively. She's being verbally abusive to the students and her colleagues. She's not communicating with parents. She's not holding parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Horton is bringing her personal life to work, and she's taking her frustrations out on adults and most especially the children. Mrs. Horton let her personal life affect her interactions with students, colleagues, parents. Mrs. Wilson was aware of this issue soon after spring break. And why did she not address this issue when it first started? She probably could have nipped it right in the bud. Mrs. Wilson did not investigate the problem until a number of parents had called, even though she knew it was happening. Mrs. Horton yells and accuses Mr. Stafford of lying during the meeting. Category 2, the proposed plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. My strategy I used were communication, investigating, documentation, education, observation, and feedback. The plan, step 1, is the de-escalation. Mrs. Horton is not behaving rationally. I'm probably just definitely shocked. We both need time to cool off. I'm gonna gather my thoughts and I'm gonna let her calm down. I'd find someone in the building to take Mrs. Horton's class for the day. Just remove her from the classroom for the day, let everything calm down. And I would review the district policy on the proper regulations for this. Step 2 is documentation. I'd go back to my office as I was gathering all my thoughts. I would document everything that's happened, dates, times, names of everyone I've spoken to, individuals present in meetings, and all information in this matter would be deemed confidential. It would not be going out to anyone else. And step 3, contacting the superintendent. You need to keep him in the loop. He's already aware of the situation. I would see if he or she have any suggestions for moving forward. I would discuss the plan I have formulated, and I would request that the superintendent is present with the meeting with Mrs. Horton, Mr. Stafford, and myself, just to kind of keep everyone on the same page, so to speak. Step 4, I would have a meeting with the school counselor to discuss available resources that are out there, possibly for Mrs. Horton. I would make sure I was telling the school counselor this is all to remain confidential. No one else is to know about this. I would ask for guidance. I would ask for is this a form of depression? Is there something else going on? Is this a normal reaction? what kind of help is available, and is Mrs. Horton a threat to herself or to the students? Because if she's a threat to herself or to the students, it's not going to be a safe environment for anyone at all in the school. Step 5, I would meet with Mrs. Horton. I would have a school union representative there to make sure everything is going according to the plan, so there's not going to be any hiccups later on. I would ask Mrs. Horton if she's okay. I would tell her I'm concerned for her well-being, as I don't want to have her with any health issues, and be able to, I just want her to know that I'm just there for her. And we would discuss the complaints from the parents, her behavior with the colleagues, about threatening students, the new reading program, and what her feelings are, and how she's been acting unprofessional, just in the school and also with Mr. Stafford. And we would discuss the plan moving forward. We'd go over review the evaluations policies. An improvement plan would be written. The plan would include steps for improvement. One of them would definitely be arriving on time to work, maintaining a professional behavior. You need to can't let your personal life come in. The communication with parents, you have to communicate. When they contact you, you have to contact them back. Professional development on coping with stress. I would conduct frequent walkthroughs through the classroom. And weekly meetings would happen for feedback, if not sooner. The plan would be reviewed by the superintendent for the approval. A future meeting with the superintendent would be set to discuss all the data collected and everything on the observations and the walkthroughs. And if the goals are not met, the discussion of possible non-renewal of the contract or termination would be a result. Step 6, meeting with Mr. Stafford. The 3 of us, actually the 4 of us with the superintendent, would all meet. We would say there are steps being taken to resolve the issues. I would definitely recommend that Julie stays in the class for at least another 2 weeks, see how things go. Mrs. Horton would have an opportunity to apologize. Mr. Stafford would be given a chance to share his feelings. And Mr. Stafford would be called in 2 weeks for a progress report, unless he actually absolutely wanted to come into the schools. I know it was a big task for him to take time off of work and to come into school, and don't want him to actually displace his family anymore from him having to take more time off of work. Step 7, I definitely call the other parents who lodge complaints. I would inform them that action is being taken. I would ask for any additional concerns, and I would ask them to stay in contact via email, phone, and if they need to contact Mrs. Horton, make sure if they're going to do an email, they CC me on it, so I'm also in the loop and I know what's going on. Step 8, I would talk to Mrs. Horton's students. I would visit with Mrs. Horton's class to discuss how everyone has their bad days, everyone has the good days, and ask them to share their feelings and changes they would like to see in the classrooms, and maybe how they deal with stress. And a big thing is that Mrs. Horton would have a chance to apologize to the kids, just kind of tell the kids that she's been going through a rough time, things are going to change, and apologies from adults go a long ways in the school, just from personal experience and just myself and other teachers. Once you apologize, just say, yeah, I messed up, I'm sorry, my behavior was unacceptable, but things are going to change. That goes a long way with students, especially first graders. Step 9, I would conduct walkthroughs. I would perform walkthroughs frequently, many times a day during the week. I would document observations. I provide feedback from Mrs. Horton on the observations, so she would know exactly what's going on. There would not be any surprises later on. Category 3, resolve the issues based on promoting the success for all students. The resolution, we had someone sub for the class on the day of the incident. The conflict resolution with the students, parents, and colleagues, and the principal, bringing everyone together talking it out. We wrote an improvement plan with specific steps that are going to be met, and we provide professional development. We're going to provide Mrs. Wharton with a buddy person on the staff for support, just in case she needs to step out and gather herself. Someone else could actually be in the classroom, because there's not enough aides to go around. Actually, I feel, to pull an aide out of the school unless that was actually going to be deemed totally necessary. And I would ask, actually, she has any need for a medical absence, because if yes, the options about meeting with the district, this could be covered under the Family Medical Leave Act, and I would have a meeting with the teachers regarding the new reading program. Moving on to category 4, debrief the problem, reflect on what you were thinking, feeling, valuing, any unresolved issues open to further investigation. I was thinking, why did Mrs. Wilson not take action the previous year? If she just would have responded, done anything, maybe this whole thing just could have been avoided. And why were Mrs. Horton's colleagues not speaking to Mrs. Wilson about this? How did the students feel about being in the classroom atmosphere? How are they going to react? How did Mrs. Wilson not know Mrs. Horton was arriving late to school? That is still just mind-blowing, how you can go that long and you just don't know. And who was filling in for Mrs. Horton when she was late? I was kind of thinking, that person, kudos to them for filling in, but also kind of one of those things, they should have reported it. And if a word of the meeting with Mr. Stafford, how quickly would that be spread out to other parents? And how would I react being a parent in that situation? If I had a teacher just start yelling at me, I really was thinking, how would I possibly react to this? Would my demeanor have been just how Mr. Stafford's demeanor was? I was upset with Mrs. Wilson for not acting sooner. I had empathy for the students. They should not be put in that situation. I also had sympathy for Mrs. Horton. She was obviously going through a lot. Husband leaving, raising 2 kids. It was definitely a tough situation. And I'm confused on why her colleagues did not speak up. That's still just, I have not worked in an atmosphere where people would not have spoke up. And I could actually relate to Mr. Stafford. I've seen awkward situations with teachers. I've been in awkward situations with teachers as parents. It is just, you can feel the frustration when things are just not happening the way you want them to happen. I was valuing Mrs. Wilson for actually taking action when she actually just did take some action. The parents for voicing their concerns. There's a lot of parents. How many parents were not voicing their concerns? And the students' needs. They are the reason we're there, and those are the most important things in the classroom, in the school. And Mrs. Wilson's reaction, I was valuing that, how she didn't just totally explode during the meeting. She calmly just got Mr. Stafford out. Mrs. Wilson for stopping the meeting, and the support system I've had in my career. I mean, there's been a lot of tough situations, and I really just don't know if Mrs. Horton actually had the support system there. Any unresolved issues? How are the parents going to react to this? If Julie changes classrooms, how many of the other parents are going to demand their kids change classes, and what's going to happen then? Did any of the other colleagues offer support to Mrs. Horton? What are the procedures for tracking their plan? And how much improvement is going to be considered acceptable in order to meet the goals? Will Mrs. Horton accept any help? Right now, it seems like she's always just not reacting well to anyone. Is she actually going to be able to accept help from people? And what are the superintendent's recommendations for this handling this situation? I would have really liked to know that part. And how is the school board going to react? As far as they're going to get word of the meeting. And is Mrs. Wilson going to change the conference about not taking action sooner? Is she going to be conferenced about why this happened last year and she didn't actually take any action? Moving on to category 5, that provide evidence that you are, as an educator, a leader promoting academic success, personal well-being for every student, and by behaving and enhancing the instructional capacity. Component 1, the academic success, made frequent walkthroughs to the classroom, making sure Mrs. Horton's classroom was under control, documented everything, providing feedback on the instruction, my observations. I just want to make sure that everything is documented, everyone's on the same page, there's not going to be any surprises. Developed and proposed an improvement plan to correct the unwanted behavior. Got the superintendent's feedback on it, got the rubber stamp of approval for that. I stated the possible consequences for not reaching the goals, for non-renewal and termination, and that would also go back to the superintendent. Component 2, the personal well-being. I had someone from that day sub for Mrs. Horton's class and the day of the incident because I really did not want the students to be able to be subjected to that. Providing a buddy for the class for Mrs. Horton. She needs to take a break. She can take a break, get away from her for a little while. The kids don't need to see her react unprofessionally. And provide professional development and relation for coping skills with stress. And providing Mrs. Horton information on the leave of absence due to medical reasons. And I know some of these conditions are covered under FMLA. And this is you can take 6 to 12 weeks off to get yourself under control, get yourself everything worked out. Component 3, the instructional capacity. I provided professional development dealing with classroom climate. She needs to be able to handle herself, needs to be able to conduct herself in a professional manner. Provided more learning opportunities with the new reading program for everybody. Conducted meetings, brought them all together. And I reviewed the evaluation policies, making sure that a school union representative who was there, Mrs. Horton, was well aware of all the steps. And we made sure we're going to make sure the designated curriculum is being taught, even if you do not agree with the curriculum. If that's the district policy, you must teach what's going to be taught. Thank you very much, and that's all I have.